September 52, BC. 60,000 Roman soldiers stood trapped between two impossibilities. Behind them, 80,000 desperate Gauls hammered at walls from inside the fortress of Alesia. In front of them, 250,000 Gallic warriors, the largest army ever assembled in Western Europe, closed in like a tidal wave. Caesar's legions were about to be crushed from both sides, caught in a vice that should have ended Rome's conquest of Gaul in a single day of annihilation. Think about those numbers for a second. 60,000 Romans facing 330,000 enemies simultaneously. That's a 5-to-1 disadvantage while fighting on two fronts at once. The fate of the Roman Republic hung on 11 miles of wooden stakes, and desperate men who knew retreat meant death. Yet by the end of this video, you'll understand how Caesar engineered the most audacious defensive siege in military history. I'm about to reveal 3 things that will change how you see ancient warfare forever. First, the double-walled death trap that defied every rule of siege warfare. Second, the 6-hour cavalry charge that decided Rome's future. And third, the moment Vercingetorix rode out alone to surrender, knowing his people's dream of freedom died with him. But here's what makes this truly unbelievable. How did Romans build 25 miles of fortifications while surrounded by enemies? What psychological breaking point made 250,000 warriors turn and run? Why did Caesar risk his entire army on a siege where he was the one being sieged? To understand how 60,000 men defeated an empire of tribes, we need to go back 6 years to when Julius Caesar first crossed into Gaul with ambitions that would reshape the world. 58 BC. Julius Caesar stood at the edge of Roman Gaul with debts that could have bought a province and political enemies who wanted him dead the moment he returned to Rome. He was 41 years old, brilliant, ruthless, and absolutely desperate. The only thing standing between him and prosecution was military glory. And the only place to find that glory was north, across the Rhine, in the vast, unconquered lands of Gaul, where 300 tribes lived free of Roman control. So Caesar did what ambitious Romans always did when they needed victory. He manufactured a crisis, claimed Gaul was threatening Roman security, and invaded with 4 legions totaling roughly 24,000 men. It was supposed to be one campaign, maybe 2. It turned into 8 years of total war. The numbers behind Caesar's desperation were staggering. He owed approximately 31 million sesterces, the equivalent of 30 years' worth of a Roman senator's salary. Think about that for a second. He was in debt so deep that normal people couldn't even conceptualize the amount. His creditors included Marcus Licinius Crassus, the richest man in Rome, who'd bankrolled Caesar's political rise and now expected returns. His enemies included Marcus Porcius Cato, the Senate's most rigid conservative, who'd spent years building a legal case to prosecute Caesar for bribery and illegal actions during his consulship. The moment Caesar's term as governor of Gaul ended, the moment he returned to Rome without military success to shield him, Cato would destroy him. Roman law was clear. A general commanding an army couldn't be prosecuted while holding imperium, military command. But the instant that command ended, he became a private citizen subject to the courts. Caesar's political protection had an expiration date, and everyone knew it. His solution was equally clear. Win military victories so spectacular that the Senate couldn't touch him, conquer enough territory to pay off his debts with plunder, and build an army loyal to him personally rather than to Rome. Here's where it gets insane. Caesar didn't wait for Gaul to actually threaten Rome. He engineered the pretext himself. The Helvetii, a Gallic tribe in modern Switzerland, were migrating west through Roman allied territory. It was a migration, not an invasion, but Caesar spun it as an existential threat. He claimed they were attempting to attack Roman Gaul, wrote urgent dispatches to the Senate warning of barbarian hordes, and marched his 4 legions north to intercept them. The Senate, always nervous about Gallic threats after the sack of Rome 3.5 centuries earlier, gave him authorization. What Caesar didn't tell the Senate was that this authorization was a blank check for unlimited conquest. Once engaged in Gaul, he could justify expanding operations indefinitely. Every tribe he conquered became a new threat requiring Roman intervention. Every victory became evidence that more victories were necessary. By the time the Senate realized what was happening, Caesar had pushed Roman control 200 miles north of the original border, and he had no intention of stopping. But winning glory in Gaul required defeating warriors who'd been fighting since childhood, in terrain Romans barely understood, using tactics Roman doctrine hadn't prepared for. And in 52 BC, those warriors would find a king who could unite them into something Rome had never faced before. An enemy who'd learned how to turn Roman strengths into weaknesses and who'd nearly trapped Caesar in a nightmare that would make Alesia necessary. For 5 years, Caesar crushed Gallic resistance tribe by tribe, using Rome's superior discipline and engineering to overwhelm numerical superiority. He defeated the Helvetii at Bibracte, smashed the Germanic king Ariovistus, crossed the Rhine twice just to prove Romans could, built a bridge across the ocean to invade Britain. Every victory brought more territory, more slaves, more gold flowing back to Rome. But it also bred something Caesar hadn't anticipated: unity. In 52 BC, a 21-year-old Gallic noble named Vercingetorix looked at the smoking ruins of his homeland and made a decision that would change everything. He raised the standard of rebellion not for one tribe, but for all of Gaul. Within months, tribes that had spent centuries fighting each other were swearing oaths to a single king. And that king had learned how to fight Romans. The scale of Caesar's conquest had been apocalyptic. By 52 BC, he'd enslaved over 1 million Gauls. Let that number sink in. 1 million human beings sold in Roman markets, families torn apart, entire villages depopulated. Another 1 million Gauls were dead, killed in battles, massacres, or starvation campaigns. Gaul's pre-war population had been roughly 10 million. Caesar had killed or enslaved 20% of an entire nation in 5 years. The survivors understood exactly what Roman conquest meant, and that understanding created something unprecedented in Gallic history. Vercingetorix was the son of Celtillus, an Arvernian chieftain who'd attempted to unite Gaul decades earlier and been executed by rival nobles for his ambitions. The son had watched his father die for trying to create exactly what Gaul needed. Now, surrounded by Roman legions and watching his people disappear into slavery, Vercingetorix decided his father had been right. Gaul's only chance was unity, and unity required a single commander with absolute authority. In winter of 52 BC, he called a council of tribal leaders and made his case. Here's what the Roman chronicles don't tell you. Vercingetorix didn't just unite tribes through speeches about freedom. He offered something more practical, a strategy that could actually beat Rome. He'd studied Caesar's campaigns obsessively. He knew Roman tactics, Roman logistics, Roman weaknesses. While other Gallic leaders still believed they could win through numerical superiority and Celtic warrior fury, Vercingetorix understood that Rome's discipline would crush that approach every single time. So he proposed something radical. Avoid pitched battles, attack supply lines, use Gaul's knowledge of local terrain, make Roman conquest so expensive in blood and resources that Caesar would be recalled. The tribal council voted him supreme commander. Within weeks, his coalition included the Arverni, the Bituriges, the Senones, the Parisi, the Pictones, the Cadorci, dozens more. Think about what that means. Tribes that had raided each other's cattle for generations suddenly swearing oaths to a 21-year-old. The coalition numbered over 250,000 warriors, the largest unified Gallic force in recorded history. But here's where Vercingetorix revealed his genius. He didn't just gather numbers. He imposed Roman-style discipline. Deserters were executed. Soldiers who broke formation were flogged. He organized supply chains, established clear chains of command, and drilled his warriors in coordinated movements. He was building a Gallic army that could fight like Romans, and Caesar's scouts were bringing reports that made veteran centurions nervous. The rebellion wasn't being led by another barbarian warlord. It was being led by someone who understood exactly how to hurt Rome. Vercingetorix understood something most Gallic leaders didn't. You couldn't beat Rome in open battle. Roman legions were too disciplined, too experienced, too methodical. They'd destroy you in formation warfare every time. But Rome had one critical weakness: logistics. Legions needed food, massive amounts of it, and they relied on foraging from conquered territory and supply trains from their bases. So Vercingetorix implemented a strategy that made Caesar's generals question whether the campaign was even survivable. Burn everything. Every town, every farm, every grain store in the path of Roman advance. Evacuate the population, deny the legions food and shelter. Force them to march farther and farther from their supply lines while Gallic cavalry harassed them constantly. It was brutal. It required Gallic civilians to watch their homes burn. But it worked. By late summer of 52 BC, Caesar's 8 legions, now totaling roughly 60,000 men, were starving. The numbers behind the Scorched Earth campaign were staggering. Vercingetorix ordered the destruction of over 20 Gallic towns in a single month. Not Roman towns, Gallic towns. His own people's settlements. The Bituriges alone burned 20 of their own villages to deny Caesar supplies. Think about what that means. Thousands of families watching generations of homes reduced to ash because their king told them survival required sacrifice. It was the kind of strategic ruthlessness that Romans themselves employed, now turned against them by a commander who'd studied their methods. Here's the logistical nightmare Caesar faced. A single Roman legion required approximately 1,500 kilograms of grain per day just to keep the soldiers functional. Caesar had 8 legions. That's 12,000 kilograms of food every single day, plus forage for thousands of cavalry horses and pack animals. Roman supply doctrine assumed that conquered territory would provide most of this through foraging. But Vercingetorix had turned that doctrine into a death sentence. Every village Caesar's foragers approached was already burned. Every granary was empty. Every field was torched before the grain could be harvested. Worse, Vercingetorix's cavalry made foraging suicidal. He commanded 15,000 mounted warriors, primarily from the Aedui and Arverni tribes, the best horsemen in Gaul. These weren't heavy cavalry meant for shock charges. They were light cavalry, scouts and raiders who knew every forest path, every river crossing, every place where Roman foraging parties were vulnerable. Roman soldiers sent to gather food were being ambushed and killed in groups of 10, 20, 50. The bodies were left in the open as warnings. Caesar's officers reported the situation in increasingly desperate terms. Legionaries were on half rations, then quarter rations. Soldiers were eating horses that died from exhaustion. Discipline, Rome's greatest weapon, was fraying at the edges as starving men became desperate men. At a war council in August of 52 BC, multiple senior commanders suggested retreat. Pull back to Roman Gaul. Resupply through winter. Return in spring with full logistic support. It was the rational choice. Caesar refused. He understood what Vercingetorix was doing, and he knew retreat would validate the strategy. Every tribe in Gaul would adopt scorched earth tactics. Roman conquest would become impossible. So Caesar made a decision that would either save his campaign or destroy his army. He ordered an assault on Avaricum, a major Gallic town that Vercingetorix had argued should be burned, but local leaders had refused to destroy. If Caesar could take Avaricum, he'd capture enough supplies to feed his legions through winter. If he failed, his army would starve before reaching Roman territory. September 52, BC. Vercingetorix pulled his army back to Alesia, a hilltop fortress in eastern Gaul, modern-day Burgundy. The position was nearly perfect. Steep slopes on all sides, strong walls, high ground that made direct assault suicidal. His plan was simple. Hold Alesia with roughly 80,000 warriors. Call for a relief force from every tribe in Gaul, and catch Caesar's legions in a pincer attack when that relief force arrived. The Scorched Earth campaign had left the Romans desperate and exhausted. One major defeat and Caesar's entire Gallic conquest would collapse. He'd be recalled to Rome in disgrace, prosecuted by his enemies, possibly executed. Vercingetorix was betting everything on this fortress, and Caesar knew it. So instead of assaulting Alesia's walls and losing thousands of men in a futile attack, Caesar did something that defied every conventional rule of siege warfare. He built a wall around the fortress, trapping Vercingetorix inside. And then he built another wall facing outward to protect his army from the relief force he knew was coming. Alesia sat on Mount Auswai, 430 meters above the surrounding plain. The plateau at the top stretched roughly 2 kilometers across, providing ample space for Vercingetorix's 80,000 warriors and the civilian population. 2 rivers, the Ouse and the Osirane, cut through the valleys on either side, creating natural moat barriers that made approach from those directions nearly impossible. Anyone attacking Alesia would have to march uphill under constant missile fire from defenders on high ground. It was the kind of position that should have been able to hold indefinitely. Think about the defensive mathematics for a second. Roman military doctrine suggested that assaulting fortified positions on high ground required at least a 3-to-1 numerical advantage just to break even on casualties. Caesar had 60,000 men facing 80,000 defenders in a fortress designed to amplify that defensive advantage. A conventional assault would have cost him 20,000 casualties minimum, probably more, and might still fail. Those weren't acceptable numbers. Here's where Caesar revealed why he was the most dangerous general Rome had ever produced. Instead of playing by conventional rules, he changed the game entirely. He looked at Alesia and saw not a fortress to assault, but a prison to seal. If Vercingetorix was waiting for a relief force, then Caesar would build fortifications strong enough to hold off that relief force, while simultaneously preventing the 80,000 warriors inside Alesia from breaking out. It was strategically brilliant and logistically insane. The plan required building 2 complete rings of fortifications simultaneously. The inner ring, 11 miles of walls, trenches, and traps facing Alesia. The outer ring, 14 miles, facing the inevitable Gallic relief army. 25 total miles of military construction, all while surrounded by enemies on both sides. Caesar's engineers calculated they'd need 30 days of continuous work. 30 days during which Vercingetorix could launch sorties to disrupt construction. 30 days during which the relief force might arrive early and catch the Romans with half-finished defenses. But here's what made this gamble truly desperate. If the walls weren't completed in time, Caesar's army would be trapped between two forces with no defensive positions. If the relief force arrived with more men than Caesar anticipated, even completed walls might not hold. And if his starving legions couldn't maintain the brutal construction pace, the entire plan would collapse. Caesar was betting his career, his army, and Rome's entire Gallic conquest on whether 60,000 exhausted, half-starved legionaries could build the most ambitious siege fortifications in ancient history before time ran out. What Caesar ordered his legions to build in September of 52 BC was the most ambitious military construction project of the ancient world. 2 complete rings of fortifications, one facing inward toward Alesia, the other facing outward toward the rest of Gaul. The inner wall, called the circumvallation, was 11 miles long, designed to keep 80,000 Gauls trapped inside Alesia. The outer wall, the contravallation, was 14 miles long, designed to hold off the massive relief army that would inevitably arrive. Together, 25 miles of wooden palisades, ditches, traps, and towers, all built while surrounded by enemies on both sides. The legionaries dug a trench 15 feet wide and 15 feet deep in front of both walls. Behind that, they dug 2 more trenches, filling one with water diverted from nearby streams. They installed sharpened stakes called lilia, hidden in pits to impale charging infantry. They built wooden towers every 80 feet for archers and artillery. They constructed chevaux de frise, wooden spikes designed to break cavalry charges. The numbers were staggering. Caesar's 60,000 legionaries had to move approximately 1.5 million cubic meters of earth. Let that sink in. 1.5 million cubic meters, all dug by hand using entrenching tools, shovels, and picks. Each legionary was responsible for moving roughly 25 cubic meters of soil, the equivalent of digging a hole 2 meters deep, 3 meters wide, and 4 meters long. And they had to do it in 30 days while maintaining combat readiness. The palisade walls required 300,000 wooden stakes, each sharpened to a point, each driven into the ground at precise angles. Roman engineers calculated they needed to fell and process approximately 15,000 trees to meet that requirement. Logging parties worked under armed guard because Gallic cavalry hunted them constantly. The towers, spaced every 80 feet along both walls, numbered over 600 structures. Each tower required foundation work, timber framing, and platforms for artillery and archers. Here's what military historians still debate today. How did Caesar's engineers coordinate construction across 25 miles of fortifications simultaneously? The answer reveals Roman organizational genius. Each legion was assigned specific sections, measured and marked by surveyors using groma instruments. Centurions enforced construction schedules with brutal efficiency. Soldiers worked in rotating shifts, 4 hours digging, 4 hours guard duty, 4 hours rest. The pace never stopped, even at night, when torches illuminated work crews digging trenches in darkness. But the defensive systems were where Caesar's tactical brilliance showed. The Lilia pits were engineering nightmares for attackers. Sharpened stakes buried in holes 18 inches deep, concealed with brush, arranged in checkerboard patterns across the entire approach to both walls. A charging warrior, or cavalry horse, would hit them at full speed and be impaled before seeing the trap. Caesar's engineers installed thousands of these devices. Vercingetorix watched the walls rising from Alesia and understood exactly what was happening. Caesar was turning the siege into a trap. On day 12 of construction, he launched a massive sortie. 80,000 Gauls poured down the hill, attacking the incomplete inner wall at multiple points, trying to break through before the fortifications were finished. Roman soldiers dropped their entrenching tools and grabbed weapons. The battle raged for 3 hours. 700 Romans died. 2,000 Gauls fell. The attack was repelled, but construction was delayed by 18 hours. The clock was ticking. The relief force was gathering somewhere in Gaul, and when it arrived, those walls had to be finished, or Caesar's entire army would be caught in the open between two enemies with nowhere to run. Construction took 30 days. 30 days of brutal labor, while Vercingetorix's warriors watched from Alesia's walls, launching raids to disrupt the work, killing Roman foragers, trying to break out before the walls were complete. They failed. By late September, Caesar's double wall was finished, and 80,000 Gauls were sealed inside a fortress that had become a prison. Both sides now faced the same enemy: time. Caesar's legions were still starving. The Scorched Earth campaign had worked. Roman foraging parties had to range farther and farther from the walls to find food, and Gallic cavalry hunted them constantly. But inside Alesia, Vercingetorix's situation was worse. 80,000 warriors, plus the civilian population of Alesia, roughly 30,000 people, trapped with finite supplies. No relief force had arrived yet. The food was running out. By early October, Vercingetorix made a decision that revealed just how desperate his situation had become. He expelled the civilians from Alesia. The mathematics of starvation were brutal on both sides. Inside Alesia, 110,000 people consuming finite grain stores. Ancient sources estimate they had supplies for approximately 30 days when the siege began. By early October, 3 weeks into the siege, those supplies were nearly exhausted. Think about that timeline. Every day inside Alesia, 110,000 people eating approximately 150,000 kilograms of food. The grain stores were emptying visibly, and the relief force hadn't arrived. Outside the walls, Caesar's situation was equally desperate. His legions were on quarter rations. Soldiers were eating anything they could find: roots, grass, leather from equipment. Roman foraging parties had to travel 15 miles from the siege lines to find villages that weren't already burned, and Gallic cavalry killed them constantly. In the first 2 weeks of October, Caesar lost over 400 men to starvation and ambush, not from battle, from trying to find food. Here's what the Roman sources try to downplay. Caesar's own soldiers were deserting. Small numbers, 5 men here, 10 men there, slipping away in the night because starving to death at Alesia seemed worse than trying to reach Roman territory. Roman desertion was almost unheard of, punishable by decimation. Execution of every 10th man in a unit. But hungry men make desperate choices. Vercingetorix calculated the food situation and reached the only conclusion that made military sense. The civilians had to go. 30,000 non-combatants consuming supplies that warriors needed. He called a council of his senior commanders and explained the mathematics. Keep the civilians and the entire garrison starves in 2 weeks. Expel them, and the warriors could hold for another month. Maybe longer if the relief force arrived. The decision was unanimous. October 5th, 52 BC. The gates of Alesia opened, and 30,000 people walked out. Women, children, elderly, all expelled from the fortress they'd called home. They walked down the slope toward the Roman walls, carrying nothing. Vercingetorix's calculation was simple and horrifying. Caesar would either let them through, which would ease the burden on Alesia, or he'd keep them trapped between the walls, which would create a humanitarian nightmare. What Vercingetorix didn't anticipate was that Caesar would choose the nightmare. The gates of Alesia opened, and 30,000 Gallic civilians, women, children, elderly, walked down the hill toward the Roman lines. Vercingetorix's logic was brutal, but rational. They were mouths to feed with no military value. Expelling them would conserve food for his warriors, and perhaps Caesar would let them pass through Roman lines, reducing the number of people suffering inside the fortress. The civilians reached the Roman walls and begged to be allowed through. Caesar refused. He couldn't feed his own men, and he certainly couldn't feed 30,000 Gauls. More importantly, letting them leave would ease the pressure on Vercingetorix, giving him more time to hold out until the relief force arrived. So the civilians sat in the no man's land between the fortress and the Roman walls, starving in full view of both armies. Within days, they began dying. Children first, then the elderly, then the women. Both sides watched, and neither side helped. It was a horror that ancient chroniclers struggled to describe. October 6th through October 13th, 52 BC. 7 days in no man's land. The civilians had no shelter, no food, no water, except what they could gather from streams in the valley. Nighttime temperatures dropped below freezing. Some tried to return to Alesia, but Vercingetorix had sealed the gates. He couldn't let them back in. Opening the gates risked a Roman assault, and taking them back meant mouths to feed he'd already decided he couldn't support. Others tried to approach the Roman walls again, begging, offering anything. Caesar's orders were absolute. No one passes. Here's what Roman sources barely mention, but Gallic accounts preserved. By day 3, children were dying of exposure and starvation. By day 5, the elderly were gone. By day 7, approximately 15,000 of the 30,000 expelled civilians were dead. Think about those numbers. 15,000 people dying in full view of 2 armies, while both sides maintained their strategic positions. It was calculated mass death, and neither commander could afford to change course. Roman legionaries standing on the walls watched women trying to feed infants who wouldn't survive the night. Some soldiers threw bread over the walls despite orders. Centurions stopped them, reinforced discipline. Caesar's strategic calculation was ice cold. Every day those civilians suffered in no man's land was another day of psychological pressure on Vercingetorix. Another day, his warriors inside Alesia had to watch their families die while they did nothing. Another day closer to the garrison's morale breaking completely. But here's what Caesar hadn't anticipated. The horror was affecting his own men. Roman soldiers had families. They understood what they were watching. Discipline held because Roman discipline always held, but the psychological cost was mounting. Veterans who'd fought in Gaul for years, who'd killed thousands in battle without hesitation, were struggling to watch children starve within sight of their positions. Vercingetorix stood on Alesia's walls and watched his own people die. Ancient sources record he wept, though whether from genuine grief or strategic frustration is debated. His warriors were breaking psychologically. They'd expelled their families to conserve supplies, and now those families were dying anyway. The strategic logic held, but the human cost was destroying morale from within. By October 13th, approximately 20,000 civilians remained alive in no man's land, starving, freezing, waiting to die. Both armies were locked in their positions, neither able to show mercy without losing strategic advantage. And then, on October 14th, Roman scouts brought Caesar the news he'd been dreading. Dust clouds on the horizon, war horns in the distance. The relief force had arrived. While 30,000 civilians starved inside of Alesia's walls, every free tribe in Gaul was gathering the largest army Western Europe had ever seen. The call had gone out in September. Vercingetorix was trapped. The Romans were vulnerable. This was Gaul's chance to destroy Caesar and drive Rome back across the Alps forever. Tribe after tribe sent warriors. The Aedui, the Arverni, the Sequani, the Bituriges. Tribes that had fought each other for generations, putting aside centuries of blood feuds to save their king. By early October, the relief force numbered between 240,000 and 250,000 men, the exact count disputed by historians. But the scale was apocalyptic. It was led by Commius of the Atrebates, Vercingetorix, cousin of Vercingetorix, and Eporiodorix of the Aedui, experienced commanders who understood what was at stake. They marched south toward Alesia, and Caesar's scouts brought the news every Roman soldier had been dreading. The relief force was coming, and it was larger than anything Rome had ever faced. The tribal breakdown was staggering. The Aedui contributed 35,000 warriors, the largest single contingent. The Arverni, Vercingetorix's own tribe, sent 30,000. The Sequani added 12,000. The Bituriges, still angry over Caesar's massacre at Avaricum, sent 15,000. Smaller tribes contributed thousands each. The Bellovaci, considered the fiercest warriors in Gaul, initially refused to send their full force, but eventually committed 10,000 under pressure from other tribes. Think about what it took to assemble that coalition. Tribes that had raided each other's territories for centuries now marching under unified command. But here's what military historians point out. Coordinating an army of 250,000 men in the 1st century BC was a logistical nightmare that should have been impossible. No unified language, dozens of different tribal customs, no standardized equipment or tactics. The commanders established a war council with representatives from major tribes, but ultimate authority was split between Commius, Vercingetorix, and Eporiodorix. It was command by committee, and that would prove critical later. The march itself was a feat. 250,000 men require approximately 375,000 kilograms of food per day. The army stretched for miles, column after column moving south through Gallic territory. They brought supply wagons, livestock that could be slaughtered for meat, foragers ranging ahead to requisition food from tribes along the route. The sound of that many men moving carried for hours. War drums, tribal horns, the thunder of thousands of horses and chariots. October 14th, 52 BC. Roman scouts positioned on high ground south of Alesia saw the first dust clouds, then banners, then the leading edge of the relief force cresting the hills overlooking the Alesia Valley. They kept coming, endless columns filling the landscape. One scout rode back to Caesar's command position at full gallop and delivered the report that confirmed every calculation, every nightmare scenario. The relief force wasn't 200,000. It was larger, possibly 250,000 men, and they were setting up camp within sight of the Roman outer walls. Caesar stood on the fortifications and watched the Gallic army deploy. 60,000 Romans caught between 80,000 inside Alesia and 250,000 outside. The double walls he'd built were about to face the test they'd been designed for. And if they failed, Rome's conquest of Gaul would end in the single most catastrophic military defeat since Cannae. Early October, 52 BC. Roman sentries on the outer wall saw dust clouds on the horizon, then banners, then the leading edge of the Gallic relief force. They kept coming, column after column, stretching for miles. Cavalry, thousands of them. Infantry in tribal formations carrying long swords and shields. Chariots, still used by some Gallic tribes, rolling across the plains. The sound of it carried for miles, war horns, drums, hundreds of thousands of voices chanting in Gaulish. Roman soldiers who'd fought in Gaul for years, veterans who'd seen the worst Caesar's campaigns could offer, stood on the outer wall and understood exactly how impossible their situation had become. Behind them, 80,000 Gauls inside Alesia. In front of them, 250,000 more. 60,000 Romans caught between walls they'd built to protect themselves, but which now felt like a tomb. Officers moved through the ranks, shouting orders, maintaining discipline, because the moment discipline broke, the moment panic took hold. The entire army would collapse. The mathematics were simple and terrifying. 330,000 Gauls versus 60,000 Romans. A 5.5 to 1 disadvantage. Think about what that means in practical terms. For every Roman soldier on those walls, there were 5.5 Gallic warriors ready to kill him. If the Gauls attacked simultaneously from both sides, the Romans would be facing enemies on two fronts with no reserves, no reinforcements, and nowhere to retreat. The Gallic relief force established their camp on the western hills, approximately 1 mile from the Roman outer fortifications, close enough to coordinate with Vercingetorix inside Alesia, close enough to see the Roman positions clearly, close enough that their war cries carried across the valley, and Roman soldiers could hear every word of defiance shouted in tribal languages. The camp itself stretched for miles. Tribal banners flew from hundreds of positions. Smoke from thousands of cooking fires created a haze that hung over the hills. Here's what Roman him. Sources admit decades later. Soldiers were openly discussing the impossibility of their situation. Centurions overheard conversations about desertion, about whether it was better to die fighting or try to escape through enemy lines. These were veteran legionaries, men who'd conquered half of Gaul, suddenly questioning whether survival was even possible. One centurion reported to his tribune that morale was, quote, Caesar understood exactly how close his army was to psychological collapse. On October 15th, he called a full assembly of officers and senior centurions. What he said is preserved in multiple accounts. But Caesar knew something his officers didn't. Holding those walls against a coordinated assault from 330,000 warriors would require perfect timing, perfect communication, and reserves he barely had. The Gallic commanders were studying Roman positions right now, looking for weak points, planning their assault. And inside Alesia, Vercingetorix was preparing his 80,000 warriors to attack the moment the relief force struck. The greatest battle of the Gallic Wars was about to begin, and Caesar's entire legacy hung on whether 25 miles of wooden walls and starving legionaries could hold against impossible odds. The Gallic relief force didn't attack immediately. They set up camp on the hills overlooking the Roman fortifications, and for a day, both sides waited. Then on the second day, the attack began. Gallic cavalry, roughly 8,000 riders, probed the Roman outer defenses, testing for weak points, drawing Roman forces out of position. It was coordinated with Vercingetorix inside Alesia. The moment the relief cavalry attacked, 80,000 trapped Gauls charged down the hill toward the inner wall, scaling ladders raised, grappling hooks thrown, warriors screaming as they tried to overwhelm the Roman defenses through sheer numbers. Caesar's legions fought on both fronts simultaneously. On the outer wall, legionaries braced against cavalry charges, pila, Roman javelins, thrown in volleys that shredded the first wave of riders. On the inner wall, soldiers hacked at Gauls trying to climb the palisades, pushing ladders back, stabbing downward with swords and spears. The traps worked exactly as designed. Gallic warriors charging the walls fell into hidden pits filled with sharpened stakes, impaled before they could reach the fortifications. October 16th, 52 BC, 9 a.m. The coordinated assault hit both walls with the force of collapsing mountains. The sound was apocalyptic. 88,000 warriors attacking simultaneously, war cries in dozens of tribal dialects, the crash of ladders against wooden palisades, the screams of men dying in hidden traps. Roman soldiers fought in shifts, 4 cohorts on the outer wall facing cavalry charges, 6 cohorts on the inner wall repelling infantry assault. The remaining legions held in reserve, ready to reinforce whichever section broke first. Here's what made this assault genuinely terrifying for the Romans. The coordination was perfect. Vercingetorix had timed his attack to the exact moment the relief cavalry hit the outer defenses, forcing Caesar to divide his forces. Roman commanders on both walls were shouting for reinforcements simultaneously. Caesar stood at his command position between the 2 walls, calculating in real time which front needed support more desperately. Send reserves to the outer wall, and the inner wall might collapse. Reinforce the inner wall, and the cavalry could break through the outer defenses. The Lilia traps were slaughtering Gallic infantry. Warriors charging at full speed hit the concealed pits and were impaled on sharpened stakes, screaming, trying to pull themselves free while the men behind them trampled forward. Ancient sources estimate 500 Gauls died in the traps in the first 30 minutes. Think about that casualty rate. 500 men dead before they even reached the walls, and the attack kept coming. The cavalry assault on the outer wall was more sophisticated. 8,000 Gallic horsemen weren't trying to break through. They were testing, probing, forcing Romans to commit reserves, while the real assault came from Vercingetorix. Roman pila volleys killed horses by the dozens, but the cavalry kept circling, drawing fire, exhausting defenders. After 4 hours of continuous fighting, both assaults pulled back simultaneously. The coordination revealed something terrifying. The Gallic commanders weren't attacking blindly. They were learning, studying Roman responses, preparing for something bigger. Roman casualties: 300 dead, 700 wounded. Gallic casualties: approximately 2,000 dead, mostly in the traps. But the walls had held, barely, and Caesar knew the next assault would be worse. The first assault failed, but it told the Gallic commanders everything they needed to know. The Roman walls were strong, but they were stretched thin. 60,000 men defending 25 miles of fortifications meant gaps, weak points, places where the defenses could be broken if hit with enough force. So the relief force adjusted their strategy. Attack at night when Romans couldn't see the assault coming until it was too late. And concentrate overwhelming force on a single weak section of the outer wall. 3 days after the first assault, in the dead of night, Gallic warriors moved silently toward a section of the outer fortifications on the western side. No war cries, no drums, just thousands of men advancing in darkness with scaling equipment and bundles of sticks to fill the Roman ditches. They hit the wall at midnight. The Roman sentries saw them too late. Suddenly, the fortifications were swarming with Gauls climbing over, fighting legionaries in brutal close-quarters combat where Roman discipline meant less and individual ferocity meant more. At the same time, Vercingetorix launched another sortie from inside Alesia, attacking the inner wall to prevent Caesar from reinforcing the outer defenses. October 19th, 52 BC midnight. 40,000 Gallic warriors attacked a 300-meter section of the outer wall in complete darkness. Think about the tactical sophistication required for that coordination. 40,000 men moving silently through darkness, maintaining formation, carrying fascines. Bundles of sticks used to fill the Roman ditches so infantry could cross without falling into traps. The silence broke only when they reached the walls. Then chaos erupted. Roman sentries on the western wall saw shadows moving, then suddenly warriors were climbing the palisades using grappling hooks and ladders. The alarm horns blew, but by the time reinforcements arrived, Gauls were already over the wall, fighting legionaries in the narrow spaces between fortifications. This was combat at its most brutal. No formations, no tactics, just men killing each other in darkness with swords, daggers, and fists. Romans couldn't see who was friend or enemy. Gauls were dying from Roman blades and from their own warriors' weapons in the confusion. Here's what made this attack genuinely brilliant. The Gauls used fire arrows to illuminate Roman positions without exposing their own numbers. Flaming arrows arced over the walls, landing in the Roman camp, creating light that showed defenders where to stand, but also made them perfect targets. Roman soldiers became silhouettes against the flames, while Gallic attackers remained in shadow. The western section was collapsing. 40,000 warriors concentrated on 300 meters of fortification overwhelmed the defenders through sheer mass. Roman cohorts stationed there were being pushed back, casualties mounting faster than reinforcements could arrive. Caesar, woken by the alarm, ran to the command position and saw flames lighting the western wall. He ordered 4 cohorts from reserve to reinforce immediately. But Vercingetorix, watching from Alesia, had timed his sortie perfectly. The moment Caesar committed reserves to the outer wall, 80,000 Gauls poured out of Alesia toward the inner fortifications. Now, Romans were fighting on both walls simultaneously in darkness, outnumbered, exhausted, bleeding. The western section of the outer wall was breaking. Gauls were pouring through gaps in the fortifications faster than Roman reserves could plug them. If that section collapsed, the entire outer wall would fall, and 250,000 warriors would flood into the Roman camp. Caesar, watching from his command position, made the decision every general dreads: personal intervention. He grabbed a shield, called for his personal guard, and rode directly into the breach. Ancient sources, Plutarch, Dio Cassius, described the moment with almost mythical language. Caesar, in red cloak, visible even in darkness, fighting alongside common legionaries, rallying men who were on the verge of breaking. The psychological effect was immediate. Legionaries who'd been falling back suddenly held their ground. Centurions reformed their units. The breach was stabilized not through tactical genius, but through sheer presence, the commander refusing to abandon his men. Within an hour, the attack was repelled, but it had been close, catastrophically close. And both sides knew the final assault was coming. 1 a.m. The breach in the western wall was approximately 50 meters wide. Gallic warriors had broken through the outer palisade and were fighting Romans in the space between the first and second defensive lines. Think about what that means tactically. Once attackers breach the first wall, they have momentum. Confusion works in their favor, and defenders lose the advantage of fortified positions. This was the nightmare scenario Caesar had built 25 miles of walls to prevent. Caesar rode toward the breach with his personal guard, approximately 200 Germanic cavalry who served as his bodyguard throughout the Gallic campaigns. The sight of the red cloak, the symbol every legionary in Gaul knew, meant Caesar himself was present. Changed everything. Roman soldiers who'd been retreating in disorder saw their commander riding into the fight and stopped running. Centurions started screaming orders. Units that had fragmented began reforming. Here's what Roman military historians study to this day. Caesar didn't bring tactical brilliance to that breach. He brought something more powerful: visible leadership. Legionaries fighting in darkness, exhausted, outnumbered, suddenly saw their general refusing to abandon them. The psychological shift was immediate and decisive. Men who'd been considering retreat decided to stand. Officers who'd been overwhelmed by the chaos found focus. Caesar personally led the counterattack into the breach. Ancient sources describe him fighting with sword and shield. though whether he actually engaged in hand-to-hand combat or simply positioned himself at the front is debated. What's undeniable is his presence turned the tide. The Germanic cavalry charged into the Gallic warriors who'd broken through, hitting them from the side while reformed Roman cohorts pushed from the front. The Gauls, suddenly caught between cavalry and infantry, began falling back. By 2 a.m., the breach was sealed. The western wall held. Gallic casualties in the night assault, approximately 3,000 dead. Roman casualties, 800 dead, over 1,000 wounded. The attack had failed, but barely. Caesar stood on the repaired fortifications as dawn broke and watched the Gallic relief force regrouping on the hills. They'd tested Roman defenses twice now and found weak points both times. The next assault would concentrate everything on those weaknesses, and Caesar had no more reserves to commit. The Gallic commanders studied the Roman fortifications and found the weakest point, Mont Rhea, a hill on the northern side of the siege ring where the outer wall ran uphill over difficult terrain. The fortifications there were thinner, the garrison smaller, and if they could take that hill, they could roll down the slope even to the Roman camp from high ground, collapsing the entire defensive system. On October 7th, 52 BC, the relief force committed everything. 60,000 warriors, led by Vercingetorix, attacked Mont Rhea. Not a probing assault, not a night raid. A full-scale attack designed to break through or die trying. At the same time, Vercingetorix led every able-bodied warrior in Alesia, roughly 80,000 men, against the inner wall in a coordinated assault. 140,000 Gauls attacking from two directions, while 60,000 Romans fought for their lives on walls they'd built to protect themselves, but which now felt like a cage. The sound of it was apocalyptic. Hundreds of thousands of men screaming, metal on metal, war horns, the thunder of siege equipment smashing into fortifications. Mont Rhea's weakness was geographical. The hill rose steeply on the northern edge of the siege ring, forcing Roman engineers to build fortifications uphill over terrain that made construction difficult. The walls there were thinner than elsewhere, only 8 feet high instead of 12. The ditches were shallower. The garrison defending that section numbered approximately 3,000 legionaries, 1/20th of Caesar's total force defending 1/15th of the total wall length. The Gallic commanders had done the mathematics. Concentrate 60,000 warriors on 3,000 defenders, and the position would collapse through sheer numerical superiority. 7 a.m. The assault began. Vercingetorix led the attack personally. 60,000 warriors advancing up Mont Rhea in coordinated waves. They carried fascines to fill ditches, scaling ladders to climb walls, and siege hooks to tear down palisades. The first wave hit the Roman defenses and was shredded by pila volleys. The second wave trampled over the dead and kept coming. The third wave reached the walls. At the exact same moment, Vercingetorix unleashed 80,000 warriors from Alesia against the inner wall. The coordination was perfect, forcing Caesar to defend both walls simultaneously with no reserves left. Roman soldiers on Mont Rhea fought in rotating shifts. 4 minutes of combat, 2 minutes of rest, while the next rank stepped forward. But there was no real rest. The Gauls kept coming, wave after wave, never giving defenders time to recover. Here's where the Roman position became catastrophic. Mont Rhea's defenders were running out of pila. Roman doctrine allocated each legionary 2 javelins. Those were gone in the first 30 minutes. Now the defenders were fighting with swords alone, hacking at warriors climbing the walls, exhaustion setting in after hours of continuous combat. Gallic warriors breached the outer palisade in 3 places. Roman centurions plugged the gaps with their own bodies, literally standing in breaches while legionaries reformed behind them. Caesar, watching from his command position, saw Mont Rea collapsing in real time. The garrison was being overwhelmed. The inner wall was holding but barely, and he had no more reserves to commit. Everything depended on what happened in the next 60 seconds. The Romans were losing. Mont Rea was falling. Gallic warriors had breached the outer wall in multiple places. The inner wall was holding but barely. Roman casualties were mounting faster than reserves could fill the gaps. Caesar stood at his command post and watched his entire Gallic conquest collapsing in real time. Then he did the only thing left. He ordered a cavalry sortie. 4,500 German and Gallic auxiliary cavalry, allied tribes fighting for Rome, were ordered to ride out through a hidden gate in the outer wall, circle around Mont Rea, and hit the attacking Gauls from behind. It was desperate, possibly suicidal, and it would leave the Roman camp virtually defenseless if it failed. The cavalry rode out. They moved fast, staying low, using terrain to mask their approach. The Gauls attacking Mont Rea were focused entirely on the walls in front of them, pushing hard, so close to breaking through. They never saw the cavalry until it was too late. 4,500 riders smashed into the rear of the 60,000-strong assault force with lances, swords, and the momentum of horses at full gallop. 10:30 a.m. The impact was catastrophic. Think about the physics of 4,500 cavalry hitting infantry from behind at full charge. Horses weighing 500 kilograms moving at 35 kilometers per hour. Lances punching through unarmored backs. The momentum alone knocked warriors forward, crushing them against their own comrades. The first 3 rows of Gallic infantry collapsed instantly, hundreds dead in seconds before they even understood what was happening. The psychological shock was worse than the physical casualties. Warriors attacking Mont Rea heard screams from behind, turned, and saw cavalry tearing through their rear ranks. Every soldier's nightmare is being attacked from the direction you're not defending. Panic spreads faster than fire in those situations. Units that had been pushing forward against the walls suddenly broke formation, warriors turning to face the cavalry threat, abandoning the assault. Here's where Roman cavalry tactics proved their genius. The 4,500 riders didn't try to break completely through 60,000 men. That would have been impossible. Instead, they hit the rear, caused maximum chaos, then wheeled and charged again from a different angle. Multiple strikes, each creating more panic, each forcing more Gallic warriors to peel away from the wall assault to defend against cavalry. The Mont Rea garrison, seeing the attack from behind, launched their own counterattack from the walls. 3,000 legionaries who'd been defending desperately suddenly pushed forward, climbing over their own fortifications, attacking Gauls who were now caught between walls and cavalry. The tactical situation reversed in minutes. The attackers became the attacked. Vercingetorix, watching his assault disintegrate, tried to rally his warriors. Small groups formed defensive squares, the standard anti-cavalry formation. But defensive squares can't maintain an assault. The momentum was gone. And once momentum breaks in ancient warfare, once soldiers stop pushing forward and start thinking about survival, the attack is finished. By 11 a.m., the assault on Mont Rea was collapsing. Warriors were retreating back toward the relief force camp, not in formation, just running. The rear attack shattered Gallic cohesion. Warriors turned to face the cavalry, breaking their assault on the walls. Roman legionaries on Mont Rea, seeing the Gallic attack falter, launched a counterattack from the fortifications. Suddenly, the Gauls were trapped between walls and cavalry, fighting on 2 fronts, their momentum broken. Panic spread. Units began retreating, not in formation, just running. And once retreat starts in ancient warfare, it's almost impossible to stop. Within an hour, the entire assault collapsed. 60,000 warriors fleeing back to the relief forces camp. Vercingetorix, watching from Alesia, saw the relief army break and retreat. He ordered his own warriors to pull back into the fortress. The double assault had failed. The next day, the Gallic relief force packed up and left. 250,000 warriors, the largest army Gaul would ever assemble, marched away and left Vercingetorix to his fate. Inside Alesia, 80,000 starving Gauls knew it was over. They'd held for 74 days. The food was gone. The relief force was gone. The walls Caesar built had done exactly what they were designed to do: turn a siege into a trap. The numbers tell the story of complete catastrophe. The relief force had lost approximately 12,000 dead in 3 major assaults. Another 8,000 wounded badly enough they couldn't march. But the psychological defeat was total. 250,000 warriors, representing every free tribe in Gaul, had thrown everything at Roman walls and failed. The tribal council that commanded the relief force held an emergency meeting on the evening of October 7th and reached the only conclusion that made sense. If they couldn't break through with 250,000 men, they never would. Staying meant watching more warriors die for nothing. October 8th, 52 BC dawn. Vercingetorix stood on Alesia's walls and watched the relief force breaking camp. Columns forming, marching away, abandoning him. Think about what that moment meant. His entire strategy had depended on the relief force. Hold Alesia, survive until they arrived, crush Caesar between 2 armies. He'd done everything right tactically, coordinated his assaults perfectly, and Caesar's walls had still held. Inside the fortress, 80,000 warriors understood they were watching their last hope disappearing over the horizon. The food was completely gone now. Soldiers were eating horses, leather, anything. Some were too weak to stand. The civilian population that hadn't been expelled was starving. Disease was spreading through the cramped conditions. Every military calculation pointed to the same conclusion: surrender or die. Here's what Gallic sources preserved, but Roman chronicles minimize. Vercingetorix called a council of his senior commanders and offered them a choice. They could try to break out, fight their way through Roman lines in a desperate sortie. Some would make it. Most would die. Or they could surrender, spare the warriors who'd followed him, and Vercingetorix alone would face Caesar's judgment. The vote was unanimous: surrender. The next day, the gates of Alesia opened, and a single rider came out. Vercingetorix, 21 years old, king of all Gaul for 5 months, rode down the hill toward Caesar's tent, wearing full ceremonial armor. Ancient sources describe the moment with theatrical detail. Vercingetorix dismounted, removed his armor piece by piece, and laid it at Caesar's feet. Then he sat on the ground in front of the Roman general, silent, waiting for his sentence. Caesar looked at the king who'd almost destroyed him, the commander who'd learned how to fight Rome better than any Gallic leader before him, and said nothing. Vercingetorix was placed in chains and sent to Rome, where he'd spend 6 years in prison before being paraded through the streets during Caesar's triumph, and then ritually strangled in the Tullianum, the traditional fate of defeated enemy commanders. The 80,000 warriors inside Alesia surrendered. Most were sold into slavery. The civilians, those who hadn't starved in the no-man's land between the walls, were returned to their tribes as a show of Roman mercy. October 9th, 52 BC 10 a.m. Vercingetorix rode through the Roman lines alone. His armor was ceremonial, gold inlaid bronze plates that caught the morning sun, making him visible from hundreds of meters away. He wore the torque, the golden neck ring that marked him as Gallic nobility. His sword hung at his side, but he made no move to draw it. This was surrender performed as theater, and both commanders understood the symbolism. Caesar stood outside his command tent, surrounded by senior officers, and watched the young king approach. Think about what was going through Caesar's mind in that moment. This was the man who'd united 300 tribes, implemented scorched earth tactics that nearly starved Roman legions, and came within hours of trapping Caesar at Alesia. Vercingetorix had been the most dangerous opponent Caesar faced in 8 years of Gallic warfare. More dangerous than Ariovistus, more dangerous than any tribal coalition. And now, he sat in the dirt, defeated. Here's what Roman sources don't emphasize, but later historians piece together. Caesar said nothing during the surrender. No speech, no acknowledgement of Vercingetorix's tactical brilliance. No respect between commanders. Just silence and chains. The message was clear. This wasn't an honorable defeat between equal warriors. This was rebellion crushed, and rebels didn't deserve dignified treatment. Vercingetorix was loaded into a wagon bound for Rome. 6 years he'd spend in the Tullianum, Rome's underground prison, waiting for Caesar's triumph. In 46 BC, he'd be paraded through Roman streets in chains while crowds cheered, then strangled with a garrote in the prison where enemies of Rome traditionally died. He was 27 years old when they killed him. The 80,000 warriors inside Alesia marched out and surrendered their weapons. Caesar distributed them as slaves to his legionaries. 1 Gallic prisoner per Roman soldier as a bonus for the campaign. Think about those numbers. 80,000 people enslaved in a single day, sold to soldiers who'd spend the next decade turning them into property. Roman legionaries became instant slaveholders, their fortunes made from Gallic suffering. The civilians who'd survived, maybe 10,000 of the original 30,000, were released. Caesar called it mercy. What it really was calculated propaganda. Show some Gauls kindness while enslaving others, and the tribes would remember Rome could be merciful if you submitted. Resist, and you'd end up in chains. The message worked. Within months, most remaining Gallic tribes surrendered without fighting. The next day, the gates of Alesia opened, and a single rider came out. Vercingetorix, 21 years old, king of all Gaul for 5 months, rode down the hill toward Caesar's tent wearing full ceremonial armor. Ancient sources describe the moment with theatrical detail. Vercingetorix dismounted, removed his armor piece by piece, and laid it at Caesar's feet. Then he sat on the ground in front of the Roman general, silent, waiting for his sentence. Caesar looked at the king who'd almost destroyed him, the commander who'd learned how to fight Rome better than any Gallic leader before him, and said nothing. Vercingetorix was placed in chains and sent to Rome, where he'd spend 6 years in prison before being paraded through the streets during Caesar's triumph and then ritually strangled in the Tullianum, the traditional fate of defeated enemy commanders. The 80,000 warriors inside Alesia surrendered. Most were sold into slavery. The civilians, those who hadn't starved in the no-man's land between the walls, were returned to their tribes as a show of Roman mercy. October 9th, 52 BC, 10 a.m. Vercingetorix rode through the Roman lines alone. His armor was ceremonial, gold-inlaid bronze plates that caught the morning sun, making him visible from hundreds of meters away. He wore the torque, the golden neck ring that marked him as Gallic nobility. His sword hung at his side, but he made no move to draw it. This was surrender performed as theater, and both commanders understood the symbolism. Caesar stood outside his command tent, surrounded by senior officers, and watched the young king approach. Think about what was going through Caesar's mind in that moment. This was the man who'd united 300 tribes, implemented scorched earth tactics that nearly starved Roman legions, and come within hours of breaking the siege at Alesia. Vercingetorix had been the most dangerous opponent Caesar faced in 8 years of Gallic warfare, more dangerous than Ariovistus, more dangerous than any tribal coalition. And now he sat in the dirt, defeated. Here's what Roman sources don't emphasize, but later historians piece together. Caesar said nothing during the surrender. No speech, no acknowledgement of Vercingetorix's tactical brilliance. No respect between commanders. Just silence and chains. The message was clear. This wasn't an honorable defeat between equal warriors. This was rebellion crushed, and rebels didn't deserve dignified treatment. Vercingetorix was loaded into a wagon bound for Rome. 6 years he'd spent in the Tullianum, Rome's underground prison, a stone cell carved beneath a forum where enemies of the state waited for execution. In 46 BC, during Caesar's quadruple triumph celebrating his conquests, Vercingetorix would be paraded through Roman streets in chains while crowds cheered. Then guards would strangle him with a garrote in that same underground cell. He was 27 years old when they killed him. The 80,000 warriors inside Alesia marched out and surrendered their weapons. Caesar distributed them as slaves to his legionaries. 1 Gallic prisoner per Roman soldier as a bonus for the campaign. Think about those numbers. 80,000 people enslaved in a single day, their entire lives reduced to property distributed like plunder. Roman legionaries became instant slaveholders, their fortunes made from Gallic suffering. The civilians who'd survived the no man's land starvation, maybe 10,000 of the original 30,000, were released. Caesar called it mercy. What it really was calculated propaganda designed to break remaining Gallic resistance without another battle.